We're a little late from our 2:20 start. This is our panel on energy policy perspectives. It's also actually more appropriate. I think it's going to be practical implementation of policy. One of the things we want to talk about a little bit today is how that policy that you've heard talk about today from Congressman Bishop and several others, the things that are happening politically, the policies that come out of Washington, D.C., that come out of federal agencies, state agencies, those are the things that affect your economics, pure and simple. And they have a bit of a yo-yo effect. It has to do with the policy and perspectives of those who are making the policy. But I guess what's important to you, and it's important to me as a county commissioner, is how to keep track of all of those things. Because as an operator, your main goal is to, let's say, in the energy business, you want to produce energy. And you want to make a profit while you do it. And some of these policies they help you or they hinder you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through here, and I've got a few things that I want to go over with our panel. I think if everybody got the app, you can get the bios from all these folks. I've been fortunate to work with with all of them for quite some time. As you look on your agenda, Ken Hoffman, who is the Deputy State Director for BLM Lands and Minerals. He's been doing this a long time. He's very good at it. Dave Ure, Executive Director of CITLA. Everybody knows what CITLA stands for and what they do. If not, we'll have a question and answer at the end. You can ask Dave. Kathleen Sagama, Western Energy Alliance. Again, another person I've worked for some time with. Very good at what she does in working for the energy industry. And Kirby Carroll. And I worked with Kirby a lot when I was with the BLM here. He wrote the NEPA documents that some of you may have been commissioned with him. Kirby now works for Newfield Exploration because they found out what a good hand he was, and they decided he should work for them full time. So these folks are very good at the practical side of policy. This is not one where we're talking about, well, we should have an all of the above type of energy policy. I'll give you the examples that I'd like to talk about today, because technically all of these have been out in the public. But the question, I think, really is, how much do you know about them? As being here at an energy summit, one of the things that I really thought would be important is to try and communicate some of these things to you. If you know about them, fine. If you don't know about them, maybe you want to learn more. Because one way or the other, they do affect our business. They affect the business of government. They affect your business, especially those in the energy industry. So before we get started, I'll go ahead and do you guys have microphones? Working microphones? Good. I would like to let each one of the panelists kind of give a little background or a little introduction about themselves. Again, each one of them should have a bio, and you have access to that through your app. But I'd like each one of them to go ahead and just give a little introduction about themselves. So Kent, would you?
All right. Hey, it's great to be here today. Microbio. The best thing that I can tell you is what put me through college was roughnecking on drilling rigs for 4 years in the Western Thrust Belt. That's where I got to love and learn about oil and gas from the dirty side. And since then, kind of worked on the paperwork side. And been in this position for about 16 years. Been with the Bureau of Land Management for 34 years, mostly involved with energy, mining, and minerals.
Thanks, Kent. Short cord? All right, we can get comfortable. Hi, my name is Kirby Carroll. As Bill mentioned, I've worked here in the basin for for about 18 years and actually came to industry through a little bit different angle. I actually have a master's degree in wildlife biology and started my career in the oil patch doing wildlife surveys, actually here in the Uinta Basin. I worked for a small environmental consulting firm that supported any and all oil and gas regulatory matters, and was real fortunate to work for a company that if you could learn it, sell it, and execute it, they would basically let you do whatever you wanted to. And so through that, I learned environmental impact statements and NEPA, worked with all of the agencies here in the basin for an extensive amount of time, and then was very fortunate to be able to go work for Newfield for the last 8 years, where I managed their environmental and regulatory matters out of Houston. I'm going to stick with what I know today, which are those things that I just mentioned, wildlife policy and NEPA. But the other thing that I think I can provide some color on today as well is how those things impact business decisions at an oil and gas company. So I look forward to it.
Kathleen Skama, President of Western Energy Alliance. We do regulatory, environmental, public lands issues, air issues for the oil and natural gas industry across Utah and the West.
Dave, and you don't want me talking about what I know the best today. We'll be talking about cows and grass and hay. Been the director of SITLA now for 3 years, of which is entitled to me to know just enough to get myself into trouble, but not enough to resolve problems. But I do know that the measles disease that SITLA has across the state of Utah, meaning our speckled sections of blue across the Utah map, we're totally not independent of ourselves. And it takes good policy, stable policy, consistent policy by the federal government and also by the state of Utah in order for us to entice people into our lands. And that's, I guess, the job that SITLA has, is trying to find a way to make a profit for the children. And it's important that we work hand in hand with all of the federal agencies and the state agencies.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you, panel. I'm going to go down, I just made a quick list while I was waiting to come up of 10 different policies or subject matter that, again, every one of you had access to, could have participated in, and the question I would have, we don't need to go through this, but I could ask on every one of them, does what everybody knows or what, if they've even heard of it. Air quality for the Uinta Basin. How many people are aware that there's an air quality issue in the Uinta Basin? That's pretty good. That's one of the things that this panel doesn't need to talk about today because there are groups working on it right now. There was a meeting yesterday of a working group that will be trying to come up with some responses, some courses of action, some way to find a way for us to try and deal with this problem without having it cost us, whether that's a cost in the amount or type of activity that we can have, or that it's not so much money that it becomes prohibitive to operate here. So that is underway. That is something that is got to move forward. It's very timely. We don't have a lot of time. The clock's running. Whether we sit here and pretend it's not there, actively resist it, or try and go along, it will go whether we go or not. The second thing, leasing reform. Everybody know about leasing reform? The BLM people do. Good. Leasing reform is how oil and gas leases are issued by the BLM, specifically in this state, because there's a master leasing plan. That was part of what leasing reform was. It had a whole lot to do with what lands were available and what could be done with them and what was happening while the studies were being done. That's a policy that was changed by the Trump administration. It came in, I think I want to say 2009 or 10 maybe, 10, and it was recently reversed. And that is something that is, depending on where you stand, a benefit. Endangered Species Act revision. Who's aware of the revision being made to the Endangered Species Act? Something you probably do want to find out about. It has been made public, but these are the everyday things that affect how you do business and probably how much it's going to cost you to do your business. How about the NEPA review changes? Maybe this was a good topic to have after all. Okay, split estate and horizontal drilling. Sage grouse planning document. Sage grouse plan amendments. Are you just in shock, or you just don't really, you know it so well you don't want to show off? Okay. The roadless rule proposal for Utah. I don't see anyone for that one. How about the lawsuit against the BLM for lands with wilderness characteristics? Okay, that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this today. Each one of these things is critically important to you, but it doesn't seem like most people know much about them. So what we want to do here is I want to have the folks on our panel who represent a variety of interests, administrators, those working within it, and those that are advocates for it, and have them choose. Say, I can either ask them or they heard the list, and have them give you their take on which one of these policies they think is important, why it's important, and what they want to see done with it, or how they want to see it change, and why. So for example, on leasing reform, I could ask Mr. Ure, I said, how do you think that leasing reform affects SITLA? And he's got a whole bunch of different answers, and some of them will affect you as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. And Kent, you were first on the list. How would you like to engage some of those issues?
I'd like to go over just a few things, but leasing reform, a little bit about permitting that you did, APDs. I'd like to touch on that a little bit. Now, first of all, if you've been paying attention since President Trump came in and Secretary Zinke, there has been a change of the tide with respect to hydrocarbons and carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels, if you will, and the policies and the secretarial orders coming down from the Washington office, from the presidential orders to the secretarial orders, on down through the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management. We've had some changes, and they have, in my mind, and I think hopefully in some of the folks in industry, that we are really beginning to streamline and carve out those things which are somewhat unnecessary in order to get development, leasing, and permitting and production moving along even better. Just for instance, from a leasing standpoint, some fun statistics. Back in the 1980s, before the 1987 Oil and Gas Reform Act, Statutory Act changed, there was about 15 million acres in Utah available for leasing. And then the act came out in 1987, Federal Onshore Oil and Gas Leasing Reform Act, and it changed from basically drawing out of a hat to get parcels that had to be competitive. And through the 90s and up in the early 2000s, we went from about 15 million acres down to about 5.5 million acres. And as of today, we only have 1.8 million acres under lease in the state of Utah. So since the 80s, we've got about a tenth of what we had back then. This administration is ramping that back up. And we have a sale in September coming right up. I have another sale in December. And between those two sales, we should be offering somewhere around half a million acres hopefully we'll get bids on the online system. Respect to NEPA, briefly. You may be aware that the environmental impact statements now, we've been guided through policy and through direction that an environmental impact statement will take 1 year. And the documents that in the past, unfortunately, Newfield can justify or verify, it's taken us in some cases 7, 8 years to get a full environmental impact statement done. So we are accelerating. We're doing our very best to meet that. And as far as the volume and the pages, some of the original or previous environmental impact statements, as you may know, have been anywhere from 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 pages, and 2 and 3 volumes that are 3 inches thick. Now we have page limitations, 150 to 300 pages, and on environmental assessments, we got to get those done in 3 to 6 months. And they're supposed to be under a maximum of 75 pages. So we're streamlining NEPA. And the idea there behind that is that we will specifically identify the issues that are germane and specific to that particular project and not be as broad as we have in the past in many cases. And we believe that if we do that correctly, it'll still be defensible. Now, the Leasing Reform Act was 87, but we've had 2 leasing reform policy changes in the last decade. It was mentioned in 2010, had a leasing reform where we started to lease only by our district. So basically, we lease one area perhaps once a year, even though we had quarterly sales. And we had master leasing plans were put into that, which have now been canceled or set aside, the ones that we were working on. And the leasing reform that we got in February or January this year, it's back to, we'll have statewide leases. Our expressions of interest, or you might call them nominations, have come up. The amount of acres that we are offering has come up, as I mentioned. And in the past, in some cases, we would defer many acres because perhaps there was some thing that was not quite exactly square with our resource management plans, and we would defer those until we could do planning, and planning sometimes takes a decade to do. Now we are doing our level best to offer leases under the existing land use plans. So that's why we're getting a lot more acres available for leasing. And then something I wanted to touch on as well, don't want to take any more time than my friends here, but the permitting. Back in 2015, we had about 1,600 applications for permit to drill pending or backlogged, whatever you want to call it. We call it a backlog. Technically, anything after 90 days, we're going to start, we call it a backlog. We had about 1,600 of those statewide, with about 1,470 of those being here in Uinta Basin, the rest of them in the rest of the state. As of today, we've been quite successful in the last couple of years. And today we have 100, well, as of yesterday, this number changes depending on how many we approve and how many we get. But yesterday when I called up our fluid mineral system, have 179 APDs backlog. So we've reduced that by 90% plus or minus. So we are moving forward. The time for approving APDs has dropped dramatically as well. Nationally, our average is about 113 days on an APD now, with about 50 of those days being on our side of the permit. The other days is when we've asked the industry to give us more information so we can get the permit completed and approved. And I'll let you know that we have a system, we call it AFMAS 2 now, fluid mineral system, that all layers of the administration can see that and see our statistics. And there's 2 things I want to mention, and I'll shut up here in just a second, but one of them is if you have an APD in, application for permit to drill in, and we send you a letter, we're supposed to send a letter 10 days of the deficiencies, and we typically will give a time frame, usually like 60 days for response. And we are informed and we're encouraged from our management, upper management, that if we don't get a response timely, that we just go ahead and return the APDs. So I'm encouraging you, and I'll encourage our staff here in this state maybe to notify some of the folks that, hey, that 60 days or that 90 days or whatever is coming up. And we can give an extension. There's no problem with that, but let's stick to the time frames, and we will. And the one other thing on leasing, we have a lot of leases. As I mentioned, we're way down right now in the state of Utah on federal leases, that a lot of leases are missing their annual payments, annual rentals, and you miss it one day and it's gone, and it has to go through a reinstatement process, and the reinstatement process has become very complicated and time consuming. And so I encourage you. Oh, and by the way, the Office of Natural Resources, ONRR, no longer sends out reminders. You probably may know that. They used to, a few years ago, send out reminders of billings. They don't do that anymore. Don't send a check to us for a rental. Send it to Honor, and do it timely, and we won't have to deal with reinstatements. We're losing a lot of leases. A lot of companies aren't asking for reinstatements either. So, just some advice. I think leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Kirby?
Thanks, Ken. I think I'll touch on a couple of things. Obviously, we mentioned NEPA. We'll also talk a little bit about the consultation process with Fish and Wildlife. I think there's been some positive things there. But Bill also mentioned, he called it the split estate, but with the onset of horizontal drilling, one of the things that's become readily apparent is that we're going to have situations where we have a well pad on private surface, and the minerals underneath the well pad are actually going to be private as well, and that the only federal component, the federal nexus, is going to be when that wellbore actually penetrates that federal lease. And there's been a new IM that's been published on that I think could really have some positive impacts on processing timeframes and the level of review as well. But I wanted to echo what Kent said too. We really have here locally, and as well as other BLM and agency offices in our other operating areas, really seen some positive momentum on processing times. And that has been really twofold, I think. We've had much greater visibility of the process and much more accountability for getting those actions accomplished and moving the ball from one stage to the next. And Kent mentioned the fact that also, there's an operator component of that too. And so, as some permits used to go into a black box and no one ever really knew exactly where they were, that increased visibility is helping them understand what it needs to get them processed. But I think the whole mindset of the analysis has also changed, and that's where the NEPA component comes in, and the actual whole philosophy of the former administration versus the new administration. The former administration had a philosophy of no net loss, and with no net loss, it was hard to come forward with a project at all without having there be some need for mitigation. And so we've recently seen policy that mitigation is now going to be a voluntary action that the proponent can bring forward, but it cannot be mandated by the agency. And I think in the NEPA realm, one of the things that was causing project delays is, particularly with EAs, there's that threshold for when do you hit a significant impact. And there is no clear-cut definition that if you do all of these things, it's not significant, and if you do these things, it is. And so the conversations became, if you don't do this mitigation, your project's going to go to an EIS. Well, that didn't very much sound like voluntary mitigation at the time. And so with this clear definition, the operators can come forth and have those discussions early on. NEPA itself, there's so many layers of it. And because of the layers, there's not necessarily the need to reinvent the wheel every single time we do a new project. And so some of the new guidance on NEPA is, have we done NEPA before? Can we use that? Can we tier to that? And if we've done multiple projects that are exactly the same, let's learn from that, shorten the process, and have the review be very succinct and only deal with the issues that are apparent for the individual project. Just because the project over in Uintah County analyzed 15 different resources doesn't mean that those resources are the same in Duchesne County, and therefore they're all necessary. We really need to pinpoint what are the issues of the exact project and keep our analysis associated with that. The other thing that I think I would encourage that isn't written in stone right now in terms of the NEPA policy is early engagement with the operator on what is technically and economically feasible. A lot of times with alternative development or ideas about mitigation or operational practices that would come forth, once the operator saw that, it was the realization that those things would either kill the economics of a project or weren't even actually technically feasible to be able to implement. And all that time in generating them could have been saved if there would have been the ability for the operator to participate early on and clarify those things. That can also be said for the involvement of our cooperating agencies. The way the NEPA process had worked in the past, you would come forth with a proposal, the lead agency would analyze the potential impacts, and at the end would send it to Fish and Wildlife and EPA to get their opinion on the project. The guidance today is encouraging early engagement and having a lead agency make decisions early on so that you don't get to the 11th hour and then realize that the project needed to change or you needed more alternatives, therefore setting the clock all the way back to 1. So I'll stop there and let Kathleen make some comments, and maybe it'll come back around.
All right. I would add on the leasing reform that the intention is to get the process time from nomination to sale down to 6 months. The 2010 leasing reforms bumped that up to about 18 months if you were lucky, years if there was an RMP being updated, and now that leasing document says you go with the RMP that's currently in place, so you don't defer for years. But getting that process down to about 6 months is kind of tiering to what Kirby said. I mean, it's not like every new lease is something we've never heard of before. You know, we've done NEPA analysis on it. It's not a big surprise each time, so that should be more something that can roll fairly quickly. I would mention that right now, Western Energy Alliance is involved in litigation supporting BLM's ability to lease. Environmental groups have challenged all lease sales in Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. I think I said Montana twice. But so we are in the process of helping BLM defend leasing. And what the environmentalists are trying to do is say that these leasing reforms are invalid, and they're trying to convince a judge that because these leases were let under these new lease policies, that they should be, these leases should be withdrawn. Well, that's just completely incorrect, because an administration has the ability to set new policy. Just like the Obama administration set policy on leasing reforms, the Trump administration is setting policy, and that is just as valid. So we'll be in court defending all of those. I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about ESA reform, the Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service is moving forward with new rules on ESA, and they do a couple of things that just make a lot of sense. First and foremost is, right now, if you're listed as, if a species is listed as endangered, it gets the same types of restrictions as a species that's listed as threatened. And threatened is supposed to be less likely to become extinct than endangered. So Fish and Wildlife Service is changing the rules to be in line with National Marine Fishery, I forget the
Yes,
well,
it
there's
is. That's the one.
yeah. So another agency already does that, and so the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing the same, but you would think that suddenly all the bunnies and the grizzly bears were going to go extinct because of that policy. Another thing it does is when looking at designations of critical habitat, they're actually going to prioritize habitat in which the species is actually found, not habitat that has not seen the species in decades, or habitat that, or land areas that don't even have the habitat appropriate for that species. So that seems like another common sense type of reform to make ESA work a little bit better. ESA has been notorious as quite a weapon for really, it's often not used to protect species, but to control land. And so these policies are meant to get the Endangered Species Act back to its roots of actually conserving species in their habitat and not so much being used as a cudgel against landowners or people like oil and gas or mining that is trying to productively use the lands. So that's a couple features of the ESA. What else in there, Kirby, that might be? I think
no compensatory mitigation, and then the other is the
Oh, right.
consultation timelines.
Reducing consultation timelines. So there's a couple good things in that, the rulemaking that's going on. I would encourage, well, Western Energy Alliance will be commenting on that rule, but I would encourage companies to consider submitting comments as well. It's great when the trades submit comments, but sometimes the agencies need to hear from companies as well. Hey, yeah, these species listings impact me. Oh, I just thought of one other. So there's a standard that's set when a species is listed, and it's often, once we reach that standard, and we saw this with the hookless cactus. I think the hookless cactus, in its recovery plan back in the early 90s, said, when we reach 19,000 species, we'll consider that recovered. Well, 100,000 species later that we've identified, because oil and gas pays for surveys to go out and count hookless cactus every year, we've documented, over 100,000 species, but it's near to impossible to get that species unlisted. So these new rules will make the standard for listing the same as the standard for delisting. And so perhaps we can actually show that we've recovered certain species, and we'll continue to protect them in the field. It's not like suddenly we're just going to ignore it and, start wantonly developing over hookless cactus. But once something is recovered and delisted, then it is not so onerous to operate in areas where that species is found, whether it's a plant or an animal. So those are some things going on right now with the ESA. We'd encourage your companies to perhaps get involved, and we can help. Western Energy Alliance can help you craft a letter. That's kind of a Me Too letter, but the more the agencies hear from companies that these policies are important, the better. Your turn.
You didn't take your allocated 35 minutes.
Well, I decided to give some to you.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the BLM over the last 18 months for the great amount of adjustments that they have done. We have worked very closely with the BLM on our exchanges and all of everything else that we work with. And they are probably down 20 to 25% or higher in the number of employees they have. But I would dare venture that they're doing 2 or 3 times more the amount of work without those employees than they were before. And my hat goes off to Kent and your employees, because we are getting a lot of satisfaction, a lot of work done, at least from the SITLA perspective. And so I tell you thank you, and I acknowledge you publicly in that situation. One of the things that affects SITLA greatly, as I said before, in the measles disease we have throughout the state of Utah, is the ability for people such as yourself and private enterprise to come in and lease 3 or 4 or 5 sections around our scattered sections there. You do not want to come in and just sit on one section. You have to protect yourself, whether it's through horizontal drilling or whatever it might be. And so you need the ability to move rapidly with leases from the BLM around our area. We still believe that we have the fastest way of giving access to our areas once you get there as far as drilling permits are concerned through our good staff. But the leasing is very important, is what adjustments you have made, not only for you but also for us in our scattered sections, and that's one of the things. I might beat up on you on this one, Ken, I don't know, but the air quality in this area here, my understanding, and we have some EPA directors here, we might want to ask them, but my understanding is with the ozone issue that we have here before us, and going down the road, if we reach non-attainment, what's going to be the possibility of knowing that Mr. Joe Q, investor, is going to want to come into the Uinta Basin and invest $100 million or whatever it might be, knowing in 5 years or 10 years from now that they're going to be able to have the same stability. That, I think, is one of the main issues that we have to have decided at the federal level, is what kind of stability are they going to have. Because we all know that this area is a little bit more difficult to drill in and to hit a home run in than it is in the Permian Basin or wherever else you might want to go in the United States. So we have to have that stability guaranteed to us here one way, if there is such a thing as a guarantee. The Endangered Species Act affects this, and specifically the sage grouse. I find it amazing that one protected species beats up on another protected species, and yet we don't want to recognize that. And let me give you an example. The wild horses. You go to the area where the wild horses have absolutely beat the ground to death, and you will find that the sage grouse has totally moved out, been killed, extinct in those areas. And yet we are not allowed to go in and do what really needs to take place with the wild horses, because Congress is afraid to have the wrath of the public come down on them, because Black Beauty and Flicka runs in the back of their mind all the time. The raven's another one. And the studies show that the raven is one of the top predators of sage grouse, but yet what do we do about the raven? Wildfires is another one, and yet do some of our federal grounds, I'm trying to be careful here, some of our federal grounds are not totally taken care of, so the wildfires do run rampant through there, and yet that's probably the #1 issue that's decimating the sage grouse today. So those are the things that we need to be working out, and a little common sense, as Kathleen said, goes a long ways in working with the Endangered Species Act. I have a little reservation right now in the new way that the sage grouse is trying to have rules written. Like I said before, I know just enough to be dangerous on some of these things, but when 5 or 6 of the governors throughout the western United States are not overly happy with what's taking place coming out of Washington, I wonder whether we're going the right way. The compulsory mitigation, that will no longer be demanded of you as producers on that. I hate compulsory anything. I want free agency. I want to be able to see and do that which I think is in the best interest of the country, whatever it is. But I'm wondering if we get down the road 3 or 4 years from now, because we haven't had compulsory mitigation, do we get the sage grouse listed anyway? Not because we haven't been working that way, but because we haven't been setting aside 5,000 acres a year, or we haven't been buying up habitat. Those are questions I would like to throw back to these 3 people right here, because I'm not knowing enough to understand what's really there. And so with that, I'll pass the mic and the time back to somebody else.
One thing I'd like to do, Dave, I'm sorry, Kathleen, let me just say this. We still have some time. I don't know if there's an appetite for questions or not. There's not an appetite for questions according to Sitla. That being the case, what I want to do is give each of the panel members One last question, which would be, given all the things that are going on, what do you feel, if you had to pick one, what would you see as probably one of the most sensible and would have the most effect moving forward? Remembering this is policy, not law. Otherwise, I think everyone would raise their hand for the Clean Air Act, but we can't do that. So we've got to talk about the policy, and then just so I can give you a chance to think about that, I'm going to pick on leasing reform, but I'm not going to pick on a side. The way when I was in BLM when it came along, and leasing reform was aimed at trying to find a way to, it was sold as this, by implementing leasing reform, we'll have less appeals. We'll have less appeals because we'll do these things, and so we'll be able to do our lease sales even though we have freshly minted resource management plans. We'll go ahead and do that. Well, the policy was implemented. How did we turn out on the appeals? Kent, did they stop? They increased. So that policy seemed to have a bit of a flaw. One of the other issues associated with leasing reform was master leasing plans. Master leasing plans amended the old resource management plan, and that was supposed to do away, absolutely. How could there be appeals on that? Have there been any sales on a master leasing plan?
Yes.
Have there been any appeals? Yes. So I think one of the lessons I'd like to take away from this, and it started with Congressman Bishop this morning, I've heard it off and on throughout the day. Policy is something that we need to be sure that we keep an eye on. We should be vigilant. Every time policy comes out, it's supposed to be done in the light of day, but primarily it's to find out what it's going to do to you, what it might mean, good or bad, what it might mean for you. Because clearly the policy in this case didn't accomplish what it said it was going to accomplish. So with that in mind, it may be that there's the issue that you would find most important is not one that I mentioned. There's still fracking, there's still the methane rule, there's a variety of other issues out there. But if you were to say, what would make the biggest difference for the industry in the Uinta Basin today, what would you think that might be? Kent will, well, no, Dave, we'll start with you this time. We'll go back the other way.
Well, I'd hate to be redundant, but I believe that today, the thing that would affect everyone in this room quicker than anything else, dollar values and the opportunity to invest in the basin, is still the air quality bill. I believe that we've got to invest in monitors so we actually have a base to work from. So we know where we're coming from, so we actually know what kind of latitude we have to go. But I believe that if we don't invest in ourselves today with air monitors, either through EPA or through the state DEQ, that will have the biggest impact on you as producers of oil or you as investors in the Uinta Basin here right now. That's what I think is the most burning thing facing us today for the immediate future.
The air quality issue doesn't scare me as much. I think we've got a marginal designation. We can work through the Clean Air Act process. Certainly more data have to be collected. Emissions inventories need to be done. Modeling needs to be done. DAQ or EPA can't just put on controls without being fully informed by the data that Dave is talking about. But we think that working through that process is doable. It will enable industry to move forward with new development while at the same time improving air quality. I would say, to answer Bill's question, one of the most impactful will be getting NEPA done in a timely manner. NEPA affects many different aspects of development. So first of all, you can't even get to the permitting stage if you can't get through NEPA. So if we can get NEPA done in a year, or for most projects in 6 months, then we can at least get to the permitting phase. When we do get to the permitting phase, we often have to do more NEPA. So if we can have that rational NEPA done in a timely manner, it just makes the whole process more smooth. So I think NEPA will have one of the biggest impacts, hopefully soonest, in the basin.
So I'm going to kind of piggyback on what Kathleen mentioned, but I'm going to give some examples that internally at Newfield and at other industry companies, their decisions on where they're allocating capital. And we talk over and over about regulatory certainty. But the next presenters are going to, with the onset of horizontal drilling, are going to show some really neat and exciting new tools for developing the resource. But the Uinta Basin is a giant, it's 3 giant checkerboards on top of one another with surface ownership, mineral ownership, and an airshed that none of them line up. But in our other basins now, we're seeing advantages of going to individual DSUs and developing them all at once and energizing the resource and extracting all of those different layers at one time. And so every one of our policies is going to have to work along the same timelines because you're only going to be as fast as the slowest regulatory process. With directional drilling, we've come light years on our surface impacts. We now are going to have very distinct corridors where our roads, pads, and pipelines are going to have to be placed to drill long laterals in sometimes multiple directions. So when we talk about the recent policy, they've looked at, and I wrote it down, that is important to note what is unnecessary. The BLM's mission is to ensure there's no unnecessary and undue degradation of the resources. Well, in order to have unnecessary and undue, you also have to realize that there must be necessary and due degradation of the habitat or the landscape. So with our roads, pads, and pipelines going to be in some very specific areas to extract the resource, we need to look and understand that those areas are going to have to be pointed at and looked at as energy corridors, and that is going to be necessary to develop the resource. And with that approach through NEPA and the understanding that we are looking at this in a responsible manner, hopefully those timeframes can be consistent enough to match our state processes so that capital can be allocated and operators can have certainty that they can execute.
You get the last word, Bill? Thank you.
More or less.
No, you're going to say the last one. No, thank you. And I'll just reiterate the secretarial orders, the presidential orders, the instruction memoranda that we get is improving our ability to meet shorter time frames and to get more leasing, more permitting, more rights of way out sooner, better, and we believe in a full defensible manner. I'll mention that our appeals, our litigation, our Freedom of Information Act requirements, or requests, I should say, have ballooned. And we believe that, yes, we might be more efficient and shorter in our documents and in our timeframes, but I still believe that we are defensible and we need to do a decent job. The unnecessary and undue degradation, it's in our FLTMA law. We have to meet that, and you're exactly right. When you do something on the ground, there's going to be a little bit of due and a little bit of degradation, and sometimes there's some fairly straightforward mitigation that can apply, and we need to do that, and that NEPA require that, some level of mitigation as well. Something I will mention that I didn't say before is that not only we've got some direction coming, but our manuals and handbooks are being revised as we speak. As time goes on, I think we will be more and more efficient, dare I say, and the federal government will be more and more efficient, particularly. And here in the Uinta Basin, The leasing in general is somewhat patchwork. There's a lot of leases out here. They're held by production or unitized. There's some patchwork in there that have been deferred in the past. They're rolling into our future lease sales, our coming lease sales, so that you won't run into, I was talking to Kirby a little bit, you get a chunk of unleased land in the middle of your project, and it's a very big problem. We want to overcome that, get that leased, get it appropriately leased, and get it properly developed. So the policies, I think our policies are going in a direction right now in this administration that will continue to improve our ability to develop the resources, and not just oil and gas, but oil shale and tar sand and coal, all of those things which perhaps in the past has been a little bit hesitant in us moving forward, but all aspects, including wind and solar, are still moving forward as well. So I have a good outlook in the future. Having 34 years, many different administrations gone through, I think we're in a good position where we're defensible, we're legal, but we're becoming more and more efficient. And when we get a little reorganization done and our staffing, has been mentioned, Mr. Ewer, our staffing gets a little more solidified, I think we'll be even better.
Okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes. Are there any burning questions anyone might have for the panel? Any smoldering questions? Lukewarm? Okay, that'll put us a little bit ahead of schedule. I think about the only thing I would like to do in closing is say this. When we had our meeting on ozone yesterday, one of the things that there was agreement upon is getting information out. All of these things are public, but it's very hard unless you are in an organization that has a person that does this, or unless you are the person that does it. It's hard to keep up with so many things, but what you don't know can put you at a disadvantage. To say it hurts you, I don't know. But what we're about to do is, one of the products coming out of our working group yesterday was to put together some of the timelines, the dates, the requirements for what is going to happen as we move forward into, for right now, minimal non-attainment, and what kind of things will be happening after that. So it will be on a website. It will be for you to go there and learn about, so that you're not just hoping it's being taken care of. And I think these folks up here and their staffs are very good resources. If you don't know, if you're getting ready to do something, and that could be a pipeline, it could be a power line, it could be oil and gas, it could be a lease, a right-of-way, anything like that. These folks, they keep up with this stuff, and they do know. Take advantage of them, and we as the county, local government, we're trying to keep up with it as well, and we will do our best to share it with you, because we really think that if you're informed, it helps you no matter what you're doing. So with that, I would like to say thank you to the panel. Appreciate your time, your insights. So if we could, how about a round of applause for the panel? Thank you, guys.